Once upon a time, many of us thought that the world was flat, and then we thought differently. Once upon a time, the year 2000 brought with it impending doom, and planes were supposed to drop, and people were supposed to die. It was Y2K. I don't know if anyone remembers, but that was the prevailing thought, that people would vanish all of a sudden because the year 2000 was the end of times. But we're still here. Once upon a time, it was thought that you couldn't have all your media or music in the palm of your hands until a few people came along and then changed things. History has done this over and over again. Over and over again, it was impossible to imagine something until it wasn't. But history has also shown us a few other things. History has shown us inhumane things that have been normalized. Many of them are some of the bane of our existence: enslavement, colonization, occupation, segregation, invasion, disenfranchisement. We look at these things now and we say to ourselves, wait, what? That was us? We used to do that? Yeah, we did. We absolutely did. And the reason is because, in my opinion, worldviews weren't expanded enough. In the examples I listed earlier, you see what can happen once you introduce a different perspective. We make better decisions. We change our minds. We do better. But on the flip side, if many of us are in positions of feeling validated and or compensated, it becomes really hard for us to want to change or consider a different perspective. Possibility, fear. One of the spectrums of life. Possibility, fear. We've created a world based on what we think is possible and what we fear. When we allow for different perspectives to exist, I think that's leaning more towards a possibility-based culture. And when we limit perspectives, that is gearing towards a fear-based culture. But here's the thing. I believe we are currently in a fear-based culture. And that's why I want to spend the rest of today talking about the importance of an expanded worldview. Now, I believe that the equation for worldview is lived experience plus exposure. Lived experience plus exposure. And throughout the speech, I'll be showing you how to apply this equation. But my goal today is for you all to consider a different view as we navigate our world. And in pure original fashion, I'm going to use the word view as the framework for today's presentation. So view. V is for vigilance, I is for intention, E is for expanded environments, and W is for warrior mindset. Okay? Shall we proceed? All right. So vigilance. What do I want you to be vigilant for? Well, a couple of things. Social constructs and power dynamics. Social constructs and power dynamics. Social constructs are simply ideas that have been created and accepted in a society. So when you think about masculinity, femininity, gender identity, government, school, countries, anything, any of these things, these are all social constructs because we agreed to them as a society. We created these things to make sense of our world, and we have behaviors attached to these social constructs. But we're not always aware of these social constructs until we are forced to be confronted with them. I remember about 2 years after I graduated from college, so this was 2013, I was living in Virginia at the time, and I got invited to this place called Lufkin, Texas. I don't know if anyone's been to Lufkin, Texas, but close to Texas A&M. And I remember it was my first wedding. I had never been invited to a wedding, and I'd never been invited to an American wedding, I should say, where I was part of the groom. I was part of the groomsmen, so I had to do all the speeches and make sure I got my tuxes ready on time. So I hopped on a plane, we got to Houston, and from Houston, we went to Lufkin, and then I landed. I thought, wow, everything is bigger in Texas. And then as soon as I got to the church, the pastor greeted me. He said his pleasantries. Hey, how are you? Where are you from? Hey, how are you? Where are you from? Got to me. Hey, how are you? Where are you from? I'm Tyre. I'm from Nigeria. Clutches his wallet. You're not going to steal my money, are you? Like those Nigerian princes? And everybody, shh, you could hear a pin drop. And then he caught himself, he was like, that's a joke, of course, yeah, whatever. Anyways, nice to meet you. A few hours later, we're getting ready for rehearsal dinners. And then, I'm giving my speech, everyone's having a good time. An older lady, had to have been in her 80s, comes up to me and says, hey, young man, I've been watching you. You're not like all these other black folks on TV. You don't have any cornrows, no earrings, no dreads. Gotta congratulate you. Keep doing what you're doing. And I was shocked. Again, this is not my place. This is a wedding. I can't cause a scene, and I assess the situation. The only black person here. And I'm like, okay, all right, breathe. And so I thought that was it. And then, the music comes on. It's this early Drake, so it was bumping. And then the N-word comes on, and everybody's like, yo, man! Looking at me, and I'm like, I need to breathe. But luckily, that was the end of the night. But that experience is something that happens multiple times over and over and over again. All those people had social constructs that limited their worldviews. They had social constructs that limited their worldview of blackness, of what it meant to be Nigerian. And in that moment, when they were forced to react to that, they reacted with what they knew. Are your social constructs limiting your worldview today? I mean, I'm not innocent. I found myself needing to update my own worldview myself. When I first came to the United States, I was 17 years old. And I don't know about you all, but for me, back then, all I knew about the United States was what I saw on TV and in the music videos. I thought every city was either California or New York, LA rather, or New York City, maybe Miami. And so I remember, coming here expecting to have Letterman jackets, being in my frat, and have everyone rush, because I heard that, I saw that in American Pie, and then I said, oh my goodness, this is what's going to happen. But so you can imagine my surprise when I came to college, and it was a town called Lynchburg, Virginia. I don't need to say anything else. Being vigilant of your social constructs matters. And the most effective way I found to do this is that equation I mentioned earlier, lived experiences plus exposure. So I want you all, everyone watching live, or maybe if you want to do this afterwards, to create two columns, lived experience, exposure, lived experience, exposure. And under your lived experiences, I want you to write this. What are your current social constructs? What social constructs do you subscribe to, and why? What social constructs do you subscribe to, and why? And under the exposure column, I want you to write who or what exposed you to these social constructs. This will give you an idea of how you currently categorize the world, how you label the world, if you will. It'll also keep you alert for disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is more sinister. Misinformation is still the wrong information. The second thing we need to be more vigilant about is, power dynamics. To understand power dynamics is to understand how influence and control is being distributed. right? In every environment, influence and control gets distributed, and depending on who has the influence, depending on who has the control, there is a dynamic. Some of it is natural in some instance. Some of you might say, hey, I'm the older brother, I'm the parent, I'm the teacher. There's a power dynamic there. But there are power dynamics everywhere around us. But what I want you to do is to dig a little deeper, even beyond the obvious. Observe your interpersonal and professional environments. Are you comfortable with what you see? Are you comfortable with what you see? I want you to look for moments of imbalance, oppression, and suppression. I spent the first decade of my life in Nigeria under 3 military regimes, 2 of them dictatorships. General Sani Abacha, who died of a supposed heart attack, and General Ibrahim Babangida. Babangida was tamer than Abacha. But either way, Babangida and Abacha, under the regimes, these were the things we had to be constantly vigilant, for, because of, the tribe we were from, because of my dad's job, because of every situation that social constructs created. But if we stop and actually act more vigilant, I think you'd be surprised by the moments of imbalance, misuse, and abuse. So, again, you're going to get out your pens. And under the 2 columns, let's apply this. Under lived experiences, I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. What authority figures in your life exist? Or, reframed, who are the authority figures in your life right now? And when have you been an authority figure in your life? As you're asking yourself these questions, who are the authority figures in your life? When have you been an authority figure? I want you to observe how power, how influence, how control was distributed. I want you to observe the behaviors, and I want you to be as honest as possible, because that's the best way we're going to get to where we want to get to today. And under exposure, I want you to ask yourself 2 more questions. Who do you create social distance from? Who do you create social distance from today, and why? Social distancing is a norm now with COVID, but I would argue that we've been social distancing from people for a long time, throughout history. And for whatever reason, we've had to make this social distance, consciously, unconsciously, we have our reasons. But who do you social distance from today, and why? And then, who have you social distanced from in the past, and why? 2 questions. A constant vigilance on social constructs and power dynamics means a constant vigilance on systems. Social constructs, power dynamics make up the systems that exist today. And so, if you're able to be vigilant, with these things, you're also more able to be aware of the contracts that you sign with society every day. I know when the world stopped in the last year, a lot of us were surprised by what we saw, or a lot of us were afraid that our worst fears were materialized. But these are the contracts that many of us have signed with our actions or inactions, and if we're not vigilant about them, it's going to be less surprising as each year comes. This also allows you to zoom out and paint a big picture. And like any artist, you need to see the whole canvas. So I want you all to embrace your inner Basquiats. And maybe like Basquiat, you can come up with a different image every time, a different interpretation of what you're seeing the world is. I think as we constantly remain vigilant, we're going to constantly be refreshing what the world looks like, because we're getting more information. One experience does not define everyone. One experience does not define a country. One experience does not define a company. And as people, we only rise to the level of awareness and vigilance that we have. So, let's move on to I, intention. Now that you've gotten a sense of how you see the world and maybe why you see the world the way you see it, I want you to intentionally create a culture of accountability. I want you to intentionally create a culture of accountability in the environments that have been erected by the social constructs and power dynamics that exist. And I believe that we need to do this because, like I said in the intro, we have a bad habit of rewarding bad behavior. We've done that several times. We do that almost every year, every generation, every decade, every century. There are several bad behaviors that we reward, and we make this culture. And if you don't believe me, look at the codes that we have today. Guy code, girl code, blue wall of silence. Any of these things have engineered codes to protect members, often at the expense of the harmed. That is not to say that there isn't a benefit of being a guy or a lady or a cop. But when there's a moment for responsibility to be taken care of, a lot of times throughout history, the instinct has been to protect based on membership and not impact. And when we protect based on membership and not impact, we're getting back to that same trap that we always do. This person looks like me, so it doesn't matter what they're doing that's bad right now. This is what leads the proverbial day to say that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but I, for one, don't believe that is 100% true. And this is coming from a person that has lived under dictatorships. I don't believe power always corrupts. I don't believe absolute power always corrupts absolutely. I believe Uncle Ben when he told Peter Parker that with great power comes great responsibility. So what's your responsibility? I believe your responsibility here is to understand the emotions behind the inability to be accountable. What is preventing you from being accountable? If I'm to share mine, it's usually fear, it's usually shame, anger, insecurity. It might be the same for you, it might be different, but when we're not honest about why we are afraid to take responsibility for actions that we might have taken, consciously or unconsciously, there's no moving forward. The default response becomes, that can't be me. I'm a good person. Ask him, ask her. Ask them. I'm a good person. But you can be a good person in a bad system. In fact, many of us have been good people in bad systems because we individualize the problems and fail to understand that every single thing that we have today is systemic. Remember, power dynamics, accountability, social constructs. So, the only way we can get out of a bad system is if we have checks and balances. And in the spirit of checks and balances, again, those columns. Under your lived experiences, I want you to answer the following. What emotions do you usually feel when you're getting defensive? It's a simple question. What emotions do you usually feel when you're getting defensive? It's going to be different for everyone, but whenever I do workshops and I'm working with companies that might have made huge mistakes, a lot of times they don't get to the root issue. And sometimes the root issue for the companies might just be, we might lose market share, or we might lose brand value. People might not want to come and work here. And so we have to cover this up. But that's always a short-term approach to a long-term problem. Now, if the answer was, hey, we messed up, we realized this is what we did, and we acknowledge that this is limited, this impact, and we've participated in misuse and abuse here. Here's our plan for growth. There's trust that's built there. I think sometimes we confuse ourselves thinking that if we hide behind our emotions that are preventing us from being accountable, that we are, able to move forward and prevent that shame and that public humiliation. But one's short term and one's long term. Also ask yourself, what are moments that you've refused to act when you know deep down that you should have? What are moments that you've refused to act when you know that deep down you should have? We've all been there. And then ask yourself why. What was it? What was it that prevented you? And then last but not least, I want you to have your compass always there. What are your values? And how have you lived them out in the past as lived experiences? So you're asking what your values are. You're asking and reflecting on moments you have chosen not to act when you know that you should have. And you're asking yourself the honest question. What are you truly feeling when you get defensive? You've lived with yourself the longest, so I'm hoping you can be honest with yourself the most. Under the exposure section, what I want you to do here is to take it out to institutions. What are times you've observed institutions refusing to act when they could have done better? Why do you think that was? What are times that institutions could have acted better, but didn't? Why do you think that is? And then the last question on that end is, what moments in your life caused you to adopt your value system? What moments in your life caused you to adopt your value system? It could be as simple as watching Superman on the screen, or Ted Lasso, or Randall in This Is Us, and seeing someone do something that is quintessentially them, despite what the outside opinion is. Now, I'm naming 3 people that have influenced me, obviously, but for you, it could be different, right? It could be anyone. And it could be Cardi B, it could be Daffy Duck, it could be anyone, but you are reacting to something that is causing you to say, that's who I want to be. And I find that we find these moments of, in sync moments, rather, when we are reading portraits of ourselves and others, or portraits of our idealized selves and others, seeing it, hearing it. It was Nelson Mandela for me as well when I was 10, because he was the only black person that I saw from a freed nation when I was under siege. Again, there are clues throughout your life. Your lived experiences and your exposure gives you insight into your worldviews and what you need to expand. The more you do this, the more you train your mind to promote transparency and to create feedback loops. Because you're going to find out things you're not going to like about yourselves. You're going to find those things out. No one's perfect. And in those moments, whether it's through a therapist, through a close friend, or through someone you may have offended upon reflection, you get those feedback loops. And through feedback, there's growth. Hey, I just realized I did all this. I didn't want, to be a perpetuator of this behavior, and I'm sorry. And I understand that you may not be ready to forgive me, but I do want you to know that I'm acknowledging my role in this. Many of those things have to happen regularly, whether it's with our spouse or friends, ex-friends. Some of you may have been bullies in high school. I'm not canceling anyone, I'm just talking about the fact that we all have moments of growth. But we need to be honest with ourselves as a society and as individuals if we're ever going to get to the moment where we can stop rewarding bad behavior. And that has to come from intentionally creating cultures of accountability. If we don't start holding ourselves, people, and systems accountable, what is the incentive to change? Moving on to E for expanding environments. This is about understanding what I call equally as good alternatives. And it's also about increasing access to information. I'm sure by now you're understanding that with more information you do better, with more information you get more curious, and with more information you learn about the world. But you're also understanding that sometimes we have paradigms that make you think there is no need for other information. And when you think there's no need for other information, it's very hard for you not to think that you're better than others. And then when you think you're better than others, it's very hard for you to want to move or understand another perspective or even consider another alternative. Yet, people celebrate birthdays in different ways. Yet, people have different ways of affirming self. Your way isn't the only way, and it's not the highway, but neither is theirs. There's beauty that comes from that semblance. We sometimes convince ourselves that we live in a binary world when we in fact live in a world of nuance. And it's modeled on our TV screens. I'm a huge sports fan, and oftentimes I'll see shows, debate shows. There'll be, is Tom Brady the greatest football player, or is he the worst football player? Well, I don't know if he's the best or the worst. Nah, stick with an opinion. You gotta have your conviction. Tell me if it's the worst or the best. But I think another person, nah, you're not good for TV. We need hot takes. Fox, MSNBC, CNN, any of these things. Whatever story gets the most clicks, gets the most reaction on whatever side you are, seems to carry the day. But in the absence of nuance, what we are promoting is, this caricatures, extreme versions of stories that may be true, but aren't always true. So, as your expanded environment, I want you to become more aware of your privileges. Certainly at this moment, you found that, hey, you've had access to certain things that others might not have had access to. And so just keep asking yourself, what are equally as good alternatives? And one way to do this is by inviting more stories of belonging, support, and access. I learned this as a professor during COVID, and I just started asking my students this question. When I was teaching during COVID, well, hopefully we're waning now with COVID, but at the height of COVID, when everything was virtual, I found myself asking my students this question: what does support mean for you? What does belonging mean for you? What does success mean for you? And they're all different answers. Some had access to Wi-Fi, some didn't. Some were caretakers all of a sudden, and so couldn't make it at certain times. Some just wanted to get a C, some wanted to get an A, some needed to graduate. But we go into many different environments, and we think we know what support, belonging, and success means for them. And then we dictate that. We make it law. And then we occupy and colonize without asking for any input. That has happened so much throughout, metaphorically, literally, today, yesterday. It happens constantly. So, I'm just inviting you to ask yourself the following questions, and then to ask these questions as you dive into new environments. What does support mean for you? What does belonging mean for you? And what does success mean for you? This is your template. I've been guiding you through two different columns throughout the talk, but these three questions here, this is inviting other people's lived experiences and what other people are exposed to. It's giving you insight into their lived experiences and their exposure, so you don't fall into the trap where your idea becomes superior to others instead of on par to them. It also leads to more accurate recordings of history and more validation of people. People we don't often see in our textbooks or on the TV screens. It leads to a fullness of self that deserves to be felt. One of the things I find as I move to different environments is that the concept of freedom is often defined in multiple ways. And two of the pronounced ways are, for some people, freedom is the ability to say and do whatever they want to do or say without consequence. And then for another group of people, freedom is the desire to be one's full self without punishment. There's a huge chasm between saying what you want to do without consequence, and being yourself without punishment. Unfortunately, being yourself is legislated against in some situations. But if we are going to expand in environments, if we're going to take our privileges to different places and work with the power dynamics that comes with that, we need to also take responsibility and make sure that we are creating access. And the best way to create access is not to assume. I heard a saying about people that make assumptions. It's to invite. What does support mean for said group of people? What does belonging mean for said group of people? And what does success mean for said group of people? Last but certainly not least is W for the warrior mindset. Now, my name is Akintayo, so Tayo is short for it, but Akin means the brave one or warrior. So I had to be a little self-indulgent here and incorporate warrior into the acronym. But I've always been fascinated with warriors. And the reason is because when I look and observe the most influential leader to me, that was obviously the late Nelson Mandela, and I often mention him, but also Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, any of these folks, right? They all had one thing in common, and that was the idea of fighting for lived experiences that weren't centered, right? They consistently did that, and they did that constantly. That is to say that it wasn't a trend, it wasn't a hobby, it was a lifestyle. It wasn't a trend, it wasn't a hobby, it was a lifestyle. And that's what it means to have the warrior mindset. To be able to work outside of the news cycle. To be able to work beyond the news cycle. We've seen many things happen in the last year. The anti-blackness, anti-Asian violence, what's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening throughout the continent of Africa, what's happening in Latin America, what's happening in Louisiana. These things are happening every day. Don't think they happen once an extreme situation happens, because that would be an insult to the lived experiences of the people that go through that every day. And so, if you are choosing to be a warrior, there has to be that Malembe mindset. That slow and steady wins the race. That methodical precision to working towards the goals you have decided to fight for. The other element of that is critical thinking. Critical thinking here is going to be your tool for war in a sense here. But the secret to critical thinking, at least in my opinion, is knowing how to express yourself and why you express yourself. That is all it is. How do you express yourself and why do you express yourself? I find that a lot of people don't know who they are outside of whatever social constructs have been created for them. That is because they haven't been reflective. They've been mostly reactive. And if you're mostly reactive as opposed to reflective, you don't know who you are. But if you're operating as a caricature in an environment that has been created to serve certain people versus other people, you become a pawn. And if you're a pawn, you're not a queen, you're not a king, and you can't fight for other people who deserve to feel privileges that allows them to feel the fullness of the spectrum of their humanity. And so critical thinking is your ability to understand why you think the way you think and how you think the way you think, because this is an effective form of rebuttal. Someone with said power comes to you and says, I don't believe said group of people deserve this. And you question them and you have your ability to defend your points. That's effective. We see this during debates. There are people that can say the right things in the right moment. And I said earlier, we have a clickbaity culture. Someone will read the headline and not do the work. But if you know the work and you know why the work isn't effective, and you can call out any straw person argument or any distraction, you are a warrior in that mindset. And so it's sharpening your critical thinking skills. It's understanding that the idea of fighting for lived experiences that aren't centered is a lifelong goal. Because if it's not a lifelong goal, the default doesn't work for everybody else. Our dear Lord once said, sometimes we're blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the manner of our revolution. But more usually, we must do battle where we're standing. Sometimes we're blessed to be able to choose the time, the arena, and the manner of our revolution. But more usually, we must do battle where we're standing. Everyone here is metaphorically standing. I know you all sitting now, but you're metaphorically standing. You're standing on something, standing for something, whether you decide to acknowledge it or not. The question, though, is will you choose to do battle? Will you? We have created the world around us based on what we think is possible and what we fear. There's a possibility-based culture, there's a fear-based culture, and I believe that we are currently living in a fear-based culture, which is why I think it's important to have an expanded mindset. So V, be vigilant, I, be intentional about the cultures of accountability, E, expand the environments that you are by promoting more safety, belonging, and success. And W, have a warrior mindset. Thank you very much.